You know that feeling when you're rushing through your morning prayer, checking your phone between Hail Marys, thinking about your endless to-do list while trying to connect with the Almighty. Your mind is everywhere except where your heart desperately needs to be. You whisper words of faith, but inside there's this gnawing emptiness, this sense that you're performing spirituality rather than living it. Maybe you've even wondered if God is listening at all, if your prayers are just echoing in an empty room. Perhaps you've caught yourself going through the motions of faith, while your heart remains untouched, unchanged, unsatisfied. You attend Mass but feel disconnected from the mystery unfolding before you. You recite prayers you learned as a child, but the words feel hollow, mechanical, devoid of the life they once held. You long for something real, something authentic, something that will bridge the gap between the God you believe in intellectually and the God you desperately want to encounter personally. This spiritual hunger isn't a sign of weak faith or insufficient devotion. It's actually evidence of something beautiful stirring within your soul, a divine invitation to move beyond surface-level religion into the depths of genuine relationship with the living God. Your restlessness is God's way of calling you home to your true identity as a beloved child of the Most High. The emptiness you feel isn't punishment for inadequate prayer, but preparation for something far more beautiful than you've ever experienced. What if I told you that the answer to this spiritual restlessness, this hunger for authentic connection with the divine, could be found in just 15 seconds? Not 15 minutes or 15 hours or 15 years of spiritual discipline, but 15 simple seconds of authentic presence. 15 seconds that changed the life of a Spanish soldier forever, and could transform your relationship with God in ways you never imagined possible. 15 seconds that revealed the secret every mystic and saint has discovered, that God isn't waiting for us to become perfect before showing up in our lives. God is already here, already present, already speaking, waiting only for us to become still enough to notice. Picture this scene from the early 16th century. Ignatius of Loyola, still known then as Íñigo López de Loyola, is recovering from a cannonball wound that shattered his leg during the siege of Pamplona. He's lying in bed, his military dreams crushed along with his bones, reading the only books available in the castle. Lives of the Saints and a Life of Christ. This man who once cared only for worldly glory, for conquering lands and winning battles, for impressing noble ladies with his courage and charm, finds himself face to face with stories of people who conquered something far greater than territories. They conquered their own souls. But let's understand who this man really was before God's grace began its patient work in his heart. Ignatius wasn't some naturally pious soul who drifted easily toward holiness. He was ambitious, vain, quick to take offense, and obsessed with his own honor and reputation. He would spend hours in front of mirrors, carefully arranging his hair and adjusting his clothes to make the perfect impression. He carried weapons not just for protection, but as symbols of his status and readiness to defend his honor at the slightest provocation. His mind was filled with romantic fantasies and dreams of military glory that would make his name famous throughout Spain and beyond. When that French cannonball shattered his leg and his dreams simultaneously, Ignatius faced what every soul eventually encounters. The moment when our carefully constructed plans meet the mysterious will of God. Lying in that bed of forced inactivity, unable to pursue the life he had mapped out for himself, he experienced something that millions of people throughout history have faced in their own ways. The collapse of the ego's agenda creates space for something infinitely greater to emerge. As he reads these accounts of saints and martyrs, something extraordinary begins to happen in the depths of his being. Different thoughts start competing for attention in his mind. Sometimes he would daydream about great deeds in the service of a certain lady of his thoughts, planning elaborate schemes to win her favor, imagining tournaments and adventures that would showcase his skill and valor. He would lose himself for hours in these fantasies, seeing himself returning from distant lands covered in glory, receiving the admiration of courts and the favor of the woman who had captured his imagination. Other times, he would imagine himself following Christ, doing the same works of penance and sacrifice as St. Francis and St. Dominic. He would picture himself walking the dusty roads of Palestine, sleeping under the stars, begging for food, caring for lepers, preaching to crowds of people hungry for truth. These images stirred something deep within him, awakening desires he had never recognized before, calling forth a nobility of spirit that his worldly ambitions had never touched. Initially, Both sets of thoughts seemed equally appealing to him. Both stirred his imagination and filled him with enthusiasm. Both seemed to offer meaning and purpose for his life. But Ignatius began to notice something subtle yet profound, something that would revolutionize not only his own spiritual journey, but the spiritual lives of countless people who would learn from his experience. After indulging in fantasies of worldly conquest and romance, he felt a certain satisfaction in the moment, a temporary excitement that seemed to promise happiness and fulfillment. But afterward, when the fantasy faded and reality returned, he found himself dry, discontented, and restless. There was an aftertaste of emptiness, a sense that he had been feeding on something that couldn't truly nourish his soul. However, when he thought about following Christ in poverty and doing penance, when he imagined himself walking in the footsteps of the great saints, not only did he feel good while having these thoughts, but afterward he remained joyful and content. There was a lingering sweetness, a deep peace that seemed to touch something eternal within him. These thoughts left him with energy and hope, and a mysterious sense that he was moving towards something true and beautiful and lasting. This was Ignatius discovering what would later become one of the fundamental principles of his spirituality, the discernment of spirits. He was learning to pay attention to the different movements within his soul, to distinguish between thoughts that lead to genuine peace and those that lead to spiritual agitation. He was becoming a student of his own heart, learning to read the subtle signs that indicate whether a particular path leads toward God or away from God. This skill of interior discernment is desperately needed in our contemporary world, where we're bombarded with countless voices telling us what will make us happy, what will give our lives meaning, what deserves our time and energy and devotion. We live in a culture that promises fulfillment through consumption, achievement, entertainment, and external validation. But Ignatius's experience teaches us to look deeper, to pay attention not just to immediate gratification, but to the long-term fruit of our choices in the depths of our souls. Think about your own experience with this kind of discernment. When you spend time scrolling social media, how do you feel afterward? When you binge-watch television shows, or lose yourself in online shopping, or chase after the latest trend, what happens in your heart when the momentary pleasure fades? Compare that to times when you've chosen to pray, to serve others, to spend time in nature, to have meaningful conversations with people you love. Notice the different quality of satisfaction, the different kind of energy that emerges from these choices. Ignatius was discovering that our hearts are like tuning forks, naturally resonating with what is true and good and beautiful, but also capable of being deceived by what merely appears attractive on the surface. Learning to distinguish between these different kinds of attraction, to recognize the difference between what feeds the soul and what merely distracts it, becomes essential for anyone seeking to live an authentic spiritual life. But the most remarkable moment was yet to come, a moment that would demonstrate the infinite creativity and tenderness of divine love. One night, as Ignatius lay in his bed of recovery, wrestling with these interior movements and trying to understand what God was asking of him, something unprecedented happened. In the quiet of that Spanish castle, with moonlight streaming through the window and the world around him settled into the deep silence of night, with only the sound of his own breathing and the distant call of night birds to break the stillness, Ignatius experienced a vision that would change not only his life, but the lives of millions who would come after him. The vision came without warning, without any special preparation or effort on his part. He wasn't engaged in elaborate prayers or mystical practices. He wasn't fasting or performing penances or trying to earn some divine favor. He was simply lying there, wounded and vulnerable, open to whatever grace might come. And in that openness, in that receptivity, heaven touched earth in the most beautiful way imaginable. He saw an image of Our Lady with the Holy Child Jesus. But this wasn't just a mental picture or a product of his imagination. This was an encounter with living persons, a moment of genuine communication between heaven and earth. The vision was brief, lasting perhaps no more than 15 seconds. But in those fleeting moments, everything changed. Time seemed to pause, eternity seemed to break into history, and the love that moves the sun and stars became tangible and personal and overwhelmingly present. Picture the scene more fully. Ignatius, this former soldier who had spent years focused on earthly battles and worldly glory, suddenly finds himself in the presence of the Queen of Heaven and her divine Son. The mother whose heart was pierced by the sword of sorrow as she watched her child suffer for the sins of the world, now appears to this wounded man with infinite compassion and tenderness. the Christ child, the eternal Word made flesh, the one who holds all creation in existence by the power of his love, looks upon this Spanish nobleman with eyes that see not his past failures, but his future destiny as a saint and founder of religious order. The worldly thoughts that had been tormenting him, the attachments that had been pulling his heart in different directions, the fantasies and ambitions and desires that had seemed so important just moments before, simply vanished. They never returned with the same power again. It wasn't that Ignatius struggled against them or fought to overcome them. They were simply dissolved by the overwhelming presence of authentic love, the way darkness disappears when light is introduced into a room. But here's where the story becomes deeply personal for each of us, where the experience of a 16th century Spanish nobleman connects with the spiritual hunger of people living in the 21st century. God didn't speak to Ignatius with a booming voice from the heavens. He didn't send an angel with a scroll containing detailed instructions for his future mission. He didn't overwhelm him with theological explanations or complex spiritual formulas. Instead, God spoke through silence, through stillness, through a brief moment of pure contemplation. In those 15 seconds of divine encounter, Ignatius learned something that would become the cornerstone of his entire spiritual method: the transformative power of simply being still in God's presence. This challenges everything our culture teaches us about productivity, efficiency, and meaningful activity. We've been conditioned to believe that unless we're doing something, achieving something, producing something, we're wasting time. The idea of spending even 15 seconds in simple receptivity, with no agenda other than being open to God's presence, can feel foreign and uncomfortable. We worry that we're being lazy or irresponsible or unproductive. But Ignatius discovered something revolutionary: that 15 seconds of authentic presence with God can accomplish more than hours of frantic religious activity. In those brief moments of stillness, the grace of God can rearrange our entire interior landscape, healing wounds we didn't even know we carried, dissolving attachments that have been blocking our spiritual growth, awakening desires we never knew existed. I want you to pause here and think about your own spiritual life. When was the last time you truly stayed still in prayer, not rushing through memorized words or mentally planning your next activity, but simply remaining in the quiet presence of the divine? When did you last give God permission to love you without feeling the need to earn that love through perfect behavior or eloquent prayers or impressive spiritual disciplines? If you find yourself struggling with this, if you feel like your prayer life has become mechanical or distant, if you sense that you're going through the motions of faith without experiencing its transformative power, I want you to know that you're experiencing something completely normal and shared by countless souls throughout history. Even the greatest saints went through periods of dryness, doubt, and spiritual struggle. Even Ignatius, who would become one of the Church's greatest masters of prayer, had to learn this lesson through his own experience of weakness and need. Your spiritual struggles don't disqualify you from God's love. They actually prepare you to receive that love more deeply, because they strip away the illusions of self-sufficiency that prevent us from recognizing how desperately we need divine grace. If this resonates with you, if you feel yourself nodding as you recognize your own spiritual journey in these words, I invite you to share it in the comments. You can simply write, "I want to learn to be still." And if you feel comfortable, briefly tell us about your own journey with prayer and silence. Your comment could be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel understood in their own quest for deeper communion with God. Sometimes the simple act of acknowledging our spiritual hunger is the first step towards satisfying it. And when we share our struggles and hopes with others who are walking the same path, we create a community of encouragement that helps everyone grow in faith. What happened to Ignatius in those 15 seconds reveals something profound about how God operates in our lives, something that challenges many of our assumptions about prayer, spirituality, and divine encounter. The divine doesn't usually overwhelm us with spectacular manifestations or dramatic interventions. God doesn't typically speak through burning bushes or parted seas or voices from the clouds. Instead, God speaks most clearly in moments of interior stillness, when we stop trying to control our spiritual experience and simply allow ourselves to be held by infinite love. During his vision of Our Lady and the Christ Child, Ignatius wasn't doing anything except being present. He wasn't performing spiritual exercises or attempting to achieve some mystical state. He wasn't trying to impress God with his devotion or earn divine favor through religious effort. He was simply there, wounded and vulnerable and open, allowing God to work within him without interference. This teaches us something revolutionary about prayer and spiritual growth that most of us have never been taught. So often, we approach our relationship with God as if it were a project to be completed or a problem to be solved. We think we need to say the right words, feel the right emotions, or achieve the right spiritual state for God to meet us. We imagine that if we just pray hard enough, long enough, perfectly enough, then God will finally respond to our efforts. But Ignatius's experience shows us that God is already present, already acting, already reaching out to us with infinite tenderness and desire for communion. Our job isn't to make God appear or to earn divine attention through impressive spiritual performances. Our job is simply to stay still long enough to notice what's already happening, to become aware of the love that has been surrounding us since before we were born. The 15 seconds that transformed Ignatius weren't just a brief mystical experience that happened to one special person 500 years ago. They were a masterclass in what it means to receive God's grace, a demonstration of the receptivity and openness that makes authentic spiritual growth possible. In our culture of constant motion, endless productivity, and perpetual noise, the idea of staying still for even 15 seconds can feel almost revolutionary. We've trained ourselves to fill every moment with activity, every silence with sound, every pause with productivity. We check our phones dozens of times per day, fill our commutes with podcasts and music, watch television while eating dinner, scroll through social media before falling asleep. We've become experts at distraction, masters of stimulation, professionals at avoiding the very stillness that could transform our lives. But spiritual transformation requires something different. It requires what Ignatius would later call reverent attentiveness, a quality of presence that allows us to recognize God's movements in our hearts and in our circumstances. This isn't a skill that comes naturally in our hyperconnected world. It has to be cultivated intentionally, practiced regularly, protected from the forces that would pull us back into spiritual unconsciousness. Think about the courage it took for Ignatius to remain still during that vision. In that moment of supernatural encounter, every instinct might have urged him to analyze what was happening, to question whether it was real, to try to understand it intellectually, to worry about whether he was losing his mind. Instead, he simply received it. He allowed himself to be changed by it without fully understanding it. He trusted the experience enough to let it transform him. This is perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of authentic spiritual life, learning to receive God's gifts without immediately trying to control or comprehend them. We want to understand before we surrender, to analyze before we accept, to figure things out before we allow them to change us. But spiritual growth often requires us to trust first and understand later, to say yes before we know exactly what we're agreeing to. The fruit of those 15 seconds was immediate and lasting. Ignatius later wrote that from that moment forward, he had such a revulsion for his past sinful life, especially sins of the flesh, that it seemed as if all the images that had previously been imprinted on his mind had been erased. Never again did those particular temptations hold any power over him. This wasn't the result of willpower or moral effort on his part. It was pure gift, the fruit of allowing God to work in those moments of sacred stillness. But God wasn't finished with Ignatius. That vision was just the beginning of a spiritual journey that would lead him from the castle of Loyola to the cave of Manresa, from the universities of Paris to the founding of the Society of Jesus, from a wounded soldier to one of history's greatest spiritual directors. Each step of that journey was marked by the same principle he learned in those crucial 15 seconds: the willingness to be still and allow God to act. At Manresa, where Ignatius spent nearly a year in prayer and penance, he would experience both profound consolations and devastating desolations. There were times when he felt so close to God that he could barely contain his joy, and other times when he felt so abandoned that he considered ending his life. But through it all, he continued to practice the art of stillness, of paying attention to the movements of his heart, of distinguishing between the voice of God and the voice of spiritual enemies. During one particularly difficult period at Manresa, when Ignatius was plagued by scruples and unable to find peace despite hours of prayer and confession, he had another crucial realization. He understood that his spiritual anguish wasn't coming from God, but from an enemy of his soul who was trying to disturb his peace. In that moment of recognition, he decided to stop analyzing every thought and feeling and simply trust in God's mercy. Once again, stillness and receptivity brought him the breakthrough he needed. These experiences at Manresa, would later form the foundation of Ignatius's spiritual exercises, a systematic method of prayer and contemplation that has guided millions of people toward deeper union with God. But at the heart of all these sophisticated spiritual techniques is the same simple principle Ignatius learned in those first 15 seconds, the transformative power of being still in God's presence. The spiritual exercises invite us into extended periods of contemplation, sometimes lasting hours or even days, but they all build on the fundamental skill of interior stillness. Whether we're contemplating the Nativity, walking with Jesus through his passion, or imagining ourselves in the upper room at Pentecost, the key is always the same: to be present, to be still, to allow God to speak to our hearts through the movements of our imagination and emotions. This is radically different from the way most of us have been taught to pray. Many of us learned prayer as a one-way conversation, where we tell God what we need and then wait for external signs or dramatic interventions. But Ignatian spirituality teaches us that God is constantly communicating with us through the ordinary movements of our hearts, through our desires, through our attractions and resistances, through our consolations and desolations. Learning to recognize God's voice in these interior movements requires exactly what Ignatius discovered in those crucial 15 seconds: the willingness to be still and pay attention. When we're constantly moving, constantly talking, constantly analyzing, we miss the subtle ways God is already present and active in our lives. But when we learn to pause, to breathe, to simply be present to what's happening within us, we begin to discover that we're living in a constant conversation with the divine. The beauty of this approach is that it's completely accessible to ordinary people living ordinary lives. You don't need to be a mystic or a theologian or a professional religious to learn the art of spiritual stillness. You just need to be willing to pause, even for 15 seconds, and notice what's happening in your heart. You can do this while commuting to work, while washing dishes, while waiting in line at the grocery store, while lying in bed before sleep. Any moment can become a moment of sacred encounter if we approach it with the same receptive stillness that Ignatius discovered in his vision. But let's be honest about the challenges involved in this practice. In our hyper-connected, overstimulated world, staying still for even 15 seconds can feel almost impossible. Our minds are conditioned to jump from thought to thought, worry to worry, task to task. The idea of simply being present without an agenda can provoke anxiety or boredom. We might find ourselves wondering if we're wasting time, if we should be doing something more productive, if this kind of prayer is really effective. These are exactly the kinds of thoughts that Ignatius would have recognized as coming from what he called the enemy of human nature, the spiritual force that tries to keep us agitated, distracted, and separated from God. One of the enemy's favorite tactics is to convince us that we don't have time for prayer, that we're too busy, too important, too needed by others to spend time in stillness. But Ignatius learned through hard experience that these thoughts are lies designed to keep us spiritually impoverished. The truth is that we can't afford not to spend time in stillness with God. Those 15 seconds of receptive presence can literally transform our entire day, our entire perspective, our entire relationship with reality. When we ground ourselves in the peace that comes from divine encounter, we approach all our other activities from a place of centeredness rather than anxiety, confidence rather than fear, love rather than self-interest. This is what Ignatius meant when he wrote about finding God in all things. He wasn't suggesting that we should see God in a superficial, sentimental way, but that we should develop the kind of spiritual sensitivity that allows us to recognize divine action in the ordinary circumstances of our lives. This sensitivity is cultivated through regular practices of stillness and attention, through developing what Ignatius called reverent love for the God who is always present, always acting, always inviting us into deeper communion. One of the most practical ways to begin developing this sensitivity is through what Ignatius called the examen, a brief prayer of reflection that can be done in just a few minutes at the end of each day. The examen involves looking back over the day and noticing where we felt most alive, most grateful, most connected to God, and also noticing where we felt drained, discouraged, or distant from the divine. This practice trains us to pay attention to the spiritual movements in our hearts and to recognize patterns in our relationship with God. But even the exam begins with a moment of stillness, a pause to center ourselves in God's presence before we begin the work of reflection. That initial moment of quiet is crucial, because it establishes the proper context for everything that follows. We're not examining our day as judges evaluating our performance, but as beloved children reflecting with a loving parent who is more interested in our growth than our perfection. This understanding of God's unconditional love was perhaps the greatest gift Ignatius received during his 15 seconds of vision. In seeing Our Lady with the Christ child, he encountered not a stern judge waiting to condemn him for his past failures, but a tender mother presenting her son as the answer to every human longing. This experience of being loved without conditions, of being accepted without earning it, became the foundation of Ignatius's entire spiritual teaching. So many of us struggle in our spiritual lives because we're trying to earn God's love rather than receive it. We think we need to pray perfectly, behave flawlessly, or achieve some level of holiness before God will truly accept us. But Ignatius's experience teaches us that God's love comes first, before our efforts, before our achievements, before our spiritual progress. Our job isn't to earn divine love, but to stay still long enough to receive it. This is both incredibly liberating and profoundly challenging. It's liberating because it takes the pressure off us to perform spiritually. We don't have to say the perfect prayer or feel the right emotion or achieve some mystical state for God to love us. God already loves us completely, unconditionally, passionately. But this truth is also challenging because it means we have to give up our illusions of control and self-sufficiency. We have to acknowledge that our spiritual life isn't really about our efforts, but about our willingness to receive what God is constantly offering. Learning to receive God's love requires exactly the same quality of stillness that Ignatius discovered during his vision. We have to stop trying so hard and start being more open. We have to resist the urge to complicate our spiritual life, and instead return again and again to simple presence, simple availability, simple trust in the God who is always reaching out to us with infinite tenderness. As we near the end of our reflection together, I want you to imagine yourself in that castle room with Ignatius, lying still in the darkness, open to whatever God might want to reveal. I want you to feel the weight of that moment, the significance of choosing stillness over activity, receptivity over control, trust over understanding. That same God who appeared to Ignatius as Our Lady with the Christ child is present with you right now, in this very moment, as you listen to these words or read this reflection. The invitation that God extended to Ignatius in those crucial 15 seconds is the same invitation being offered to you right now, today, in the midst of your ordinary life, with all its complications and challenges and demands. Will you stay still long enough to receive what divine love wants to give you? Will you trust that God is present and active in your life, even when you can't feel it or see it clearly? Will you believe that 15 seconds of authentic presence can be worth more than hours of distracted activity? The beautiful truth that Ignatius discovered is available to every one of us. You don't need to be a saint or a mystic or a professional religious to experience the transformative power of stillness in God's presence. You don't need perfect circumstances or ideal conditions or freedom from all distractions. You just need the willingness to pause, to breathe, to offer yourself to the God who has been waiting patiently for this moment of connection. If these reflections on the power of stillness and prayer have touched something deep in your heart, if you sense that God is calling you to a deeper, more authentic spiritual life, I want to invite you to be part of our community of faith here on this channel. We're not just sharing religious information or theological concepts, but walking together on a journey toward deeper intimacy with the God who loves us beyond our wildest dreams. Each week, we explore the wisdom of the saints and the teachings of the Church, always with the goal of helping each other grow in authentic spirituality that transforms not just our prayer lives, but our entire approach to living. By subscribing, you'll join thousands of other seekers who are committed to finding God in the midst of their ordinary lives, people who understand that faith isn't just about believing certain things, but about entering into relationship with the living God. This isn't about adding one more obligation to your busy schedule, but about discovering resources that can transform the way you live, pray, and love. Your spiritual journey matters deeply to God, and it matters to this community of faith we're building together. Every person who joins us brings unique gifts, insights, and experiences that enrich our shared exploration of divine love. As you go forward from this moment, carry with you the memory of Ignatius lying still in that castle room, open to the transforming power of God's grace. Remember that the same God who appeared to him as Our Lady with the Christ child is present with you now, waiting not for your perfect prayer or your flawless spirituality, but simply for your willingness to be still and receive the love that has been pursuing you your entire life. In a world that worships speed and noise and constant motion, choosing stillness is a radical act of faith. It's a declaration that God's presence matters more than our productivity, that divine love is more important than human achievement, that 15 seconds spent in authentic communion with the infinite can transform everything that follows. The saints understood this secret, and now you understand it too. The question is not whether God is ready to meet you in stillness, because divine love is always ready, always available, always reaching out with infinite patience and tenderness. The question is not whether you deserve this encounter, because God's love isn't based on our worthiness, but on divine generosity. The question is simply this: will you give God the gift of your presence? Will you offer the treasure of your attention? Will you trust that 15 seconds of authentic stillness might just change everything? Your next 15 seconds of stillness might reveal the purpose for which you were created. They might heal wounds you've been carrying for years. They might awaken desires you never knew existed. They might connect you with the love that is the source and destiny of your life. Will you give God that gift? Will you give yourself that gift? The choice, as it was for Ignatius, is entirely yours.